We are very privileged today to have Todd Wynward as our guest speaker. He is going to be speaking to us about climate change. His title is entitled, "The Climate's Changing, So Why Aren't We?" And he also has his new book available for us in the back, Rewilding the Way. He is a bit of a jack of all trades. So in addition to being an author, an educator, a wilderness trip leader, he has also helped found a wilderness-based public school. He is attempting homesteading in the high desert of New Mexico, which sounds really amazing. So his interests are very varied and really, really fascinating. So please, Todd Wynward.
I'm just going to check if I'm on. All right, I am on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I don't often live in a place where it's 100% chance of rain, so my skin feels very good. As an educator, we often start out with an anticipatory set. That means to kind of tell you what I'm going to do, so then as a student, you're prepared for it. And you can walk out if you want early. You know, I'm going to give you the lowdown. So I'm first going to honor you. I'm going to challenge you. And then I'm going to invite you into a new decade-long walk together. So that's kind of the basis of my talk today. It's an art form for me. I've never been to a place where I'm scheduled for, I think, 16 different speaking engagements in 6 days. And as an aspiring and fairly new author, I have to sort of cut and paste and decide what I'm going to talk about. So if what I'm talking about today, right now, doesn't interest you, don't worry. I have another one coming sometime this week. But you may want to ask questions at the end that are unrelated to what I just said, and that feels okay to me as long as we give people time to talk about what we talked about today. But if you have some other passion you want to talk about, that's fine. That said, the title, as I mentioned, as my host mentioned, is "The Climate's Changing, So Why Aren't We?" The first thing I want to say is I have a crush on Harrisonburg. I have a crush on EMU. From what I can tell, EMU and Harrisonburg are already years ahead of most other cities and towns in our country in terms of transitioning to a new kind of economy and having a huge faith-based impetus behind a lot of amazing initiatives. So I only have heard this recently. Is there anyone here who's involved with something called like the gas tax group or something like that? Awesome. Like, this is what I understand is this is an idea of self-chosen tithing to a petroleum-based economy and recognizing that what that is a sin. This is a necessary evil that isn't actually necessary. And we're transitioning into a new economy, and these people are choosing to look at the end, look at their receipts and say, we need to tithe back. We need to give back and offset those carbon emissions. That's an example of self-generating, earth-honoring discipleship. I understand also that like EMU, for example, has done so many types of systemic changes within its institution. Huge things that cost money to retrofit to a new economy. We also have, I guess, a sustainability auditor. I believe that someone is actually examining all the curriculum and saying, how is sustainability woven into each element here? Those are things that so many other places don't even do yet. And so for that, in terms of why aren't we changing, I would cross that out and say, EMU is changing. Harrisonburg is changing. So I'm going to use as a point of departure several assumptions that we are not starting at a beginning level here, either in ideology or theology or in practice. So instead, I'm going to plunge right into some advanced level course stuff because I think this community is ready for that. That said, the point of departure is that this is, from what I understand, a pseudoscience series. I'm standing on the shoulders of people who have come before. I understand there's a woman named Lisa Shirk who gave a layout about climate change and the immigrant demographics that are associated. So there's both an economic and an environmental crisis, shall we say, that's looming. There's a perfect storm of both environmental and economic unrest that is going to be happening and is already happening. So I'm assuming that I'm not trying to convince you of that. I'm going to put that to the side and assume that we already understand that a crisis is looming and we need to adapt and mitigate. And yet somehow we don't. We don't as a human society. So my point is that in terms of transformation, there's a lot of individual change happening here. There's a lot of local organizational change happening here, perhaps even regional. However, as a denomination, we are still addicted to petroleum if you're a Mennonite. As a nation, we are addicted to petroleum and overconsumption. And then as Christians in general, we are a far cry from what we're meant to be. So if you identify with any of those labels, this is hopefully for you. The question is, what do we do and how do we change to that point? Because EMU and Harrisonburg, you have a call, but it's a much bigger call. I have a call, but it's a much bigger call. God is calling us to become the people we've always meant to be. And that's a totally different realm of humanity than what we are now. So how do we make that leap forward in this crisis time? I'm going to encourage some movements today that I think will aim to those things. We basically need to think of frameworks that catalyze or are a catalyst for fast transformative action. There is a term, first of all, for Christians that I'd like to introduce that is not mine, called watershed discipleship. How many of you have ever heard of this term before, just so I know? Is this? Okay, so very little right now. Ched Myers is a activist and theologian in Southern California who is a deep mentor to many of us probably in this room. And he coined a term called watershed discipleship. I then have taken that and turned it into a larger movement that's beyond Christianity called the Watershed Way. The Watershed Way is not meant to be Christian alone. It's meant to be a strand of Christianity that can come and go into a much bigger stream of social change. So I'll be using those two terms today, watershed discipleship and watershed way. Watershed discipleship, to me, is compelling and intriguing. It blends these two things rarely connected, science and spirituality, data and sacred. And so watershed discipleship, Ched Myers gave a double entendre, and I added a third with his blessing, so together we've created a triple entendre. So here it goes. Watershed discipleship, first of all, is in this watershed moment of history, in this economic and environmental crisis, to practice our discipleship of Jesus. Not to deny what is going on, which is too often the case, but rather radically act, meaning to the root as a disciple. The second entendre is to be a disciple within your watershed. And so this becomes a place-based, earth-honoring way of living. As Wendell Berry has said, we can't save nature. What is nature? We can save or work with a million different little neighborhoods, a million different places, but we have to root ourselves in a specific place to practice that. We can't just say, oh, I love the earth, without actually loving this earth. And so a place-based stewardship is the second entendre. And the third is the piece that I added, where it's actually about becoming a disciple of your watershed, to treat your region as rabbi. So this idea of looking at your watershed is defined by where the water trickles into your area, what biotic community is there, and all you have to do is go to the top of a mountain and look down and you'll notice where your watershed is. It can be huge, it can be a microshed. The point is that you are learning from your rabbi under the larger rabbi of Jesus, or of whatever else that faith you may be following, is this idea of treating your watershed as teacher, so learning from the land. It's strange, once you realize that you desire to relocate, is when I realize how currently dislocated I am. And how I think it's an American right that I should buy whatever I want, whenever I want, from wherever I want, and throw it away however I want, and think that that's normal every day. That's a far cry from the person God wants me to be. And so here I am, as Paul said, doing the very things that I do not want to do. I am addicted to petroleum-based and overconsumption lifestyles. And yet I spent 5 years living in a yurt, which is like a Mongolian tent. My wife and I did a life experiment and chose to live for 5 years, carrying our own water. We heated with a wood-burning stove. It basically had a membrane of foil that was about R7 insulation, for those of you who know what that means. And we were living in Taos in the mountains, and it was negative 20 outside, and we got it to be 58 inside, even on the coldest nights, and that was pretty good. And so here we are kind of roughing it and trying this out, but we still had a cappuccino maker, had a couple of cell phones, had a laptop per person, we love Netflix, drive a Prius. We even go 100 miles to Trader Joe's to get like Parmesan cheese and our favorite wine for cheap and stuff like that. So here we are trying to do more than most people in America do, and yet hopelessly addicted still to the same kind of patterns. So in no way do I stand myself as some exemplar who is already going somewhere, as much as I hope that you all agree we're in the same boat together. And we somehow have to elevate, and yet we have this addictive nature. It's very aware that when you look back toward the Bible and you look at things like Paul discussing principalities and powers, and you think about corporations today, and you think about not sins like little peccadillos of wrongs that I did, but rather institutional sin and structures that cause me to not become the person that I want to be, is I need healing and transformation. And so healthy religion is right at the heart of this. And liberal, progressive, academic environmentalism can't touch that. So even though we're very late to the game, if we of people of faith can start moving, a true reformation and revival and revolution can happen in this planet, starting with us coming late, but then burning with a spiritual fire that can move us. And if you look back at any of the major historical revolutions in this country and beyond this country, every single one of them has a deep, deep spiritual reservoir that caused people to go far beyond what they thought they could do. And so I think this is our Exodus time. This is our time where we have been in bondage. And we've been in bondage to baubles and to technology and to comfort. And we need to learn how to be stripped down and leaner, kind of like a rabbi would correct an immature disciple. Like, wake up. What are you doing? We have something to do together. And so I invite us to be on a journey. And this journey is not just watershed discipleship. That's our Christian thing. And we can step into our watersheds and then look around and realize there's a lot of other people who don't identify as Christian, and a lot of species that certainly don't identify as Christian. And so how does a Jewish rabbi walk the watershed way? How do my neighbors at Taos Pueblo walk the watershed way? They've been doing it for 1,000 years. Taos Pueblo is the 1,000-year-old continually inhabited settlement. It and another pueblo in New Mexico both tie for longest continually inhabited settlement in North America. These people have been living in their watershed using local materials for a lot longer than any groovy new environmentalist has. 500 years ago, the Spanish conquistadors came along, and they brought something called the churro sheep with them, and the churro sheep was basically a walking department store. It provided meat and milk and clothing. So they brought it with, and then the local Navajos adopted it. It became the Navajo churro sheep. Here they were, it was an object of conquest that then they used to then have that become the lifeblood of the Four Corners. So we have two different traditions, one 1,000 years old, one about 500 years old that are in the area that I live. And so Anglos who are interested in environmental place-based living are newcomers on the block. So who am I to come and tell them that, hey, I've got a watershed discipleship that I'm going to brand you with? But rather, how can I come from my humble place to learn from their humble place how to be earth-honoring people and work together? And so the Watershed Way, I hope, is a big enough tent. And so I'm laying out a blueprint for possible, radical, large-scale social change, starting from possibly within a humble Mennonite perspective. So the idea that I am espousing with the Watershed Way is a 10-year life change experiment that is covenanted together. I became, whether you believe it or not, something called a minister for watershed discipleship just this year in the spring. As I mentioned earlier, I think I'm the only Mennonite minister for watershed discipleship that exists. We don't know what that means yet, but Albuquerque Mennonite and Mountain States Conference decided to license me in that category. So for me, my first thing is moving around Mountain States and finding out the good works that are already going on, honoring those things, lifting them up, and saying, this is the beginning. For example, Alamosa, Colorado, some of you may know that place. There's a small Anabaptist group there that helped get a 38-acre place that was going to be slotted for an RV park, and they turned it into a 38-acre wetlands and CSA preserve last year. They worked with their community. I think a lot of you might have been involved in a Greenbelt initiative here that brought bike lanes along in various parts of Harrisonburg. Like, these are the kind of things where Mennonites and others join into secular groups and help transform that or move that forward into earth-honoring ways. That would be a step in the idea of the Watershed Way. The Watershed Way is inherently a 12-step model. It is a confession model. It is knowing that we are addicted to these systems even as we try to escape them. And so we borrow from our brothers and sisters in the recovery movement. And so the first step of the Watershed Way is to admit that you have to turn over to a higher power. Some of us who say we believe in God don't do a whole lot of trusting in God. We somehow think that we can do it all right. And so this idea of admitting that where our life is out of control and admitting to a higher power and basically coming back, as the addict says, keep coming back. So a monthly meeting is required if you dare to join this Watershed Way movement. And it would be a small group in your home church, in your community. It might be something that crosses across denominational lines. It might be just a bunch of addicts getting together and talking about their addiction to petroleum. But it would be naming that each month, asking for forgiveness, moving forward together, and then not just after you meet once a month, that then in your region you might have a regional hub, and that might be the greater Harrisonburg area. And there might be one of you brave enough to be that hub coordinator. You might talk to me about every 6 months or so and share out from your home community what's going on. I'll be doing the same thing in the Mountain States. So the Mountain States has at least 4 communities that are pledging to do this. And we'll be gathering together in January to do our 1-year evaluation. We'll share best practices, we'll hear good stories, we'll lament, we'll look at how the planet has changed, what levels of oxygen depletion have changed, we'll look at what parts per million have changed, and actually make a status report, kind of a state of the climate and the state of our own behavior. One of the things I've just recently done is commit personally to the Paris Pledge. The Paris Pledge is related to the Paris UN talks that are happening in December. And this is one of those climate change summits that's happened before, Kyoto Protocol, et cetera, and we can feel really jaded about stuff, and we can say, boy, those nations, they're so unwilling to change, those nations. But if we don't commit to something, why should we ever expect them to commit to something? Again, a healthy religious response is to be self-transformation even as we speak prophetically to the nations. And so this idea of a personal Paris Pledge, and we should never expect the nations to do something that we're not willing to do. So this idea of what steps are you taking, and I have some information about the Paris Pledge if you want. There's a national group called Interfaith Power and Light that works with 40 different states already, and it hopefully will be in all 52. And this idea of gathering before the storm. I have a Franciscan friend, a Sister Joan Brown, who will be taking our Paris pledges from New Mexico to the Paris summit and showing how much individual grassroots energy is happening to show the nations, you had better change. And so if you want to have hope, that's one way of doing that. Making significant corporate commitments, not just you, but your body of other Watershed Way people. You need to do something significant together. It might be that, for example, you're committing together to the Paris Pledge, or you're committing together to a local bioregional food covenant, that you are changing your attitudes personally and with your group. Because so many of us have been saying, well, I can do something, but I can't get my group to do anything. This is time for us to start asking our groups to do something. So if you are willing to meet yearly in your region and monthly in your home group, then every 2 years, if you would like to, meet with me at the Mennonite Convention in Kansas City, for example, or in Orlando, for example. And let's have every 2 year coming together to see how our communities are doing. This is something that we initiated 6 months ago in the Mountain States, and has gotten enough traction that the North American Mennonite Creation Care Network is interested in having it be a strand within the larger Creation Care. So Watershed Way will soon become a strand that affiliate groups can join and stay connected through the Creation Care Network. So instead of reinventing the wheel or trying to create some other website somewhere, we want to use that mechanism and energy right now to do that. And so the Watershed Way, what does it look like? I've spoken pretty vaguely about it. I want to tell just a little bit about what Albuquerque Mennonite has done, for example. They have a zero waste committee in which they are analyzing the waste. They have a daycare center that meets there during the week. They have a dumpster in the back. Somehow it always got filled up and no one knew exactly why or how and what happened. So they started sorting through stuff and finding out so much biodegradable waste was going right into the dumpster. They talked to the child care group during the week. They decided that, hey, let's do an analysis. So they pulled everything out of the dumpster 3 different quarters in a row to kind of analyze their waste. And they're finding more and more consciousness about how people individually do their waste and reducing together. They've decided in their kitchens to put ceramic mugs only and have people wash everything all the time. Just small things like that. But then we also did a Living More with Less conference. We decided to join, Living More with Less is, at least for the last 40 years or so, a pretty deep Mennonite value. And it also has been long before that. But once Doris Jansen wrote that book, a lot of people have flocked to the idea of more with less. So we had a More with Less Fest in Albuquerque, and we celebrated that with a lot of other secular groups that are already doing the tiny house movement, or they're doing solar power movement, or things like that. And here comes Mennonite Church joining instead of like, you have to come to our place. And so this idea of joining in is powerful. Why we chose a 10-year period of why did we say a decade long? Just a few concepts about that. A decade is not today's newspaper, and it's also not a tectonic plate. It's more like a tree. And thinking more like a tree is a much better framework for us humans than either of the other two. We don't have to kill ourselves because something didn't happen this month, and we also don't have to wait until forever. So we get to jump right on that and work together month by month. Also, 2025 is the anniversary, the 500th anniversary of Anabaptism. So this idea of how transformative are we today, 500 years after our roots began, is a great timeline and benchmark and question for us. So I guess I wanted to just invite you into this idea of joining a transformative, culture-wide, denomination-wide movement and see what you think. Today, this conversation that I just have given with you is a starting point that I hope for a decade long of organizing. If you don't understand the roots of it, or you want more theory, or you want to know the scriptural context of why we do all this, I have a lot of other talks to give, and this book frames out a lot of that. But why should we be living an earth-honoring, despair-erasing, culture-defying Christianity? Because that's what Jesus wanted us to do, and that God has been waiting for us to become the people that we have yet to become. And so for that, I think we need a revival. And by doing that, we then might bring back the American dream to be truly a good life that honors all creatures. Thank you. I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions in case people have them. Your turn if anyone wants to give something. The woman in the audience commented that she appreciated the fact that I named a lot of the things that I wasn't doing right, as well as those that we were, perhaps. And I do want to stress that fact, that this idea of we have to think of ourselves as addicts in recovery. And we've been doing some experiments like raising yak in our area of northern New Mexico. It's a lot like Mongolia, so we've been raising quinoa, growing quinoa and raising yak. And after 5 years of raising yak, my friend who's the real rancher realized that it's much more trouble per pound than any other beast. And that as long as the food is good inside the fence, the yak might stay. But otherwise, there's really no fence that will hold the yak. So, we have the chance right now, because we have some affluence and surplus economy, and we have some healthy ecosystem, to try these kind of experiments about what will work in my place. Or can I adapt my taste buds to a different kind of grain than shipping it in from China, or something like that. So both the experimentation piece and the confession piece of stumbling as we move forward are vital to me in this movement. My book is called Rewilding the Way, and it is both about wilderness and then also the metaphor. It's not only literal wilderness, but the idea of being in undomesticated space or uncolonized space, however you can get it. If you're living in the middle of a metro, Philadelphia, for example, you can have an interior wilderness, or you can go to a blighted space, or you can go to a natural space. But leaving technology behind for a time is like fasting. It is a form of fasting, of intentionally doing without for a while. One of the things that I often practice, because I tend to be a human doing, not much of a human being, is to stop thinking I can modify my reality and to know that God is good and things are okay. And so taking a half a day or a day and just appreciating what is for what it is, including there might be a spill on the floor, or including that there might be some dry crops outside, but that idea of letting go of technology for a time and letting go of my need to modify my existence for a time is a way of surrendering and accepting and modifying. So there's that piece, even if you can't get out into the real wilderness. It's interesting that even the African-American slave experience, Dolores Williams wrote an amazing book in which she talked about some songs from the slave era that talked about the half-done Christian needing to go into the wilderness. And so even as physically shackled beings, they knew that they needed to find a place that was not domesticated by the master, by the plantation owner, and that they could indeed find places interior and exterior where they found their own truth and their own ability to understand Exodus in a different way. Yes, sir?
How do you recommend doing that as a student, like taking a step back as a student? If I were to take a whole day to be a human being instead of a human doing, I would get so far behind in my classes.
That is excellent, and all I have to say is you got another thing coming. He asked, as a student, how would I suggest about rewilding or about stepping out for a day from his environment? And I would just say, first of all, that although you think your life is full right now, as adults, it gets a lot more full. And I think that one of the things I want to just suggest to you, and I don't know if you would agree with this yet in your life, but I'm just going to throw this out here to both young and old. You are occupied. Your entire personality, your brain, your heart, your concept of what you think makes you happy has been drilled into you by corporations since you were in the womb. So there is an entire occupying force of programming that you have to deprogram and dismantle. There's time for learning and unlearning. And the way we unlearn our cultural role is by stepping outside enough. And so I can say for a fact that it might be that you can do your studies and then find an hour to come out and say, what do I really love? This is, to do experiments in your life, to see if you can start eating foods from your local bioregion, start looking at ingredients on the label of things, or find out the origin of where things come from. You'll be surprised how much you are fed by this petroleum insight. But any kid anywhere can start growing their own food. Any kid anywhere can start looking at the feral landscape around and start collecting knowledge and skills. Try to sleep outside for one night. Try to sleep outside and start your own fire for one night. Not too much. You can go anywhere and start learning some of your own skills. What if you lived outside for a month? You could still go to school every day. What if you didn't take a shower for a week? What would that be like? Would people judge you and therefore exclude you because you stunk? Just like millions of years of human history? So it's just a very recent time that we have said that this is normal. And so I would just say, try to be a little abnormal. I see a hand back here. Well, it's a both and. That's the thing, is at this point, like, I'm going to be talking another session about, there's a guy named Derek Jensen who's pretty well known as a writer who talks about endgame and talks about we have to spend all of our time protesting the principalities and powers. Like personal shower, like taking a shorter shower doesn't matter, basically, is what he says. Doing a personal recycling, even if all of America started biking right now, if you start looking at data, that it's just a tenth of the problem at best, a 15th of the problem at best, even if all of America suddenly transformed and didn't use any petroleum. And so on his level, it's like, it looks so bleak, we have to change huge structures. My thought is that unless we transform our own hearts and our own practices, we're not driven to that level. I can't act with fire unless I'm also hungry in my belly. If I don't feel it, if I don't weep for the environment that I see, then I could just do it like a head game. Oh, I should sign this petition, but it doesn't burn. I'm not the planet until I feel like the planet. I don't know if it made national news, but in southern Colorado, in Silverton, Colorado recently, the EPA was meaning to do something good, and instead they popped a toxic bubble, and effluent from old abandoned uranium mines started flowing down the Chama and Animas River watersheds, which is just to the west of me, right down into Santa Clara Pueblo, which is already under the shadow of Los Alamos, which is where the bomb was tested many a time. These people are living with a legacy of our crazy, rapacious exploitation of the land. Unless we imbibe and say, I am this watershed, I don't think that we have any hope of actually being transformative. So I have to root in my place, and it's a scary thing for me to think, what if I'm eating stuff that's radioactive? I can just leave and be like, see ya, just kidding, I'm going to move somewhere else. But this is our planet. As far as I know, it's the only one that we can live on. So I'm going to need to stake my claim in New Mexico. Yes, sir.
Hearing this talk, it sounds like this is, you use Mennonite language a lot, so I'm wondering if you, and Mennonite and maybe connected with the land, so the mountain, what about a broader culture? What about, how do you apply this in an urban setting where there's even less, in some ways, less connect with the land just naturally? I'm just wondering if you could push it out. Because I think in your book, you speak much more broadly than you have today so far, as far as what people group this is for and about.
Yeah, thank you. I do think that humans in general, human, modern, affluent society, if we want to have any hope in the planet's healing, have to radically transform and rewild, because the planet is going to heal itself one way or the other. And we might be considered a virus or a cancer in the larger scheme of things, or we might be considered agents of healing and moving to a brand new place. I do believe the universe itself is going through its own adolescence. And if you look at a larger cosmology, the idea of that this is actually a natural and healthy place that we are in order to transform. And oftentimes, it's often that darkest night before the dawn kind of concept, that this is when human potential is at its greatest possibility. And so I think that the bad news is worse than most people think, and the good news of how quickly we might be able to adapt is vastly different than what we think. And so this moment of change, what I encourage is that I do believe that we have roughly 10 to 20 years to really move into not just greenwashing our economy. It's good to transition everything over to solar energy. That's awesome. But we also need to change our very habits, our very consumer habits. And so that's where healthy religious authority comes in. This is where we assert ourselves as beings, as moral beings. We have the technology to do anything, but we don't have the moral agency of anything but children. We just kind of do whatever sounds fun. And so like right now we've got issues of food justice and seed sovereignty, and issues of how much, I mean, we've always modified we've already always modified our food. Corn used to be about like this in the Anasazi days. You hike around in northern New Mexico, and all the time you see ancient cliff dwellings with little teeny native corn. And we have seed selected and harvested over the generations to make bigger and better corn. And that's been wonderful for humans. But do we start manipulating with gene splicing? What does that mean? So these are issues that anyone, anywhere can start taking more moral authority in their lives and breaking from business as usual. And that's my big pitch, is whatever you do, wherever you are, it's time to break from business as usual, because the good life isn't that good. We're stressed out, we fight too much, we worry too much, we hoard too much, we defend too much, we love too little, we give too little. Like, for some reason, we're the richest nation in the world, and we keep thinking we might lose something. We walk around stressed out all the time instead of having a transition into an easier, more grace-filled life of enoughness. And so that notion of wherever you are, can you live with enough instead of too much, would be one great message that is already deep within the Mennonite tradition. Sorry, I went back to Mennonites just then, but that idea of the good life in America, actually, just to touch on this is something that's fascinating, is Ecuador developed a new constitution in 2008. America as in the United States, has valued life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is very individualistic. Ecuador came up with this idea of the good life, sumat kasai in the Quechua language, is about a good decision is made when it's good for me, good for my human community, and good for my far more than human community. And that's when something is a right. That is right living. They don't have the economics and the structure yet to have this idea fully implemented in their country. There's a whole lot of hypocrisy going on about this new constitution, just like we stumble into anything that's values-driven. Yes, ma'am.
Can you speak about your 1,000 nights that you've been out, and also comment on wilderness retreats that you lead?
Yes, she just asked me to comment on the 1,000 nights in the woods and the wilderness retreats. So I'm far more interested than you. I mean, it would be nice if you're like, wow, I really want to buy this hot new book. This is cool. And wow, this is really great. I want to bring Todd to speak somewhere. What I'm much more interested about is the movement building and the experiential transformation that happens when people get together in wild places. And so I'm offering several different types of wilderness experiences. And also I've been asked by a couple of different denominations, Presbyterian and Mennonites, to work with youth leaders who then work with kids. And how do we rewild our narrative for youth? And so I'm taking a couple of different week-long wilderness trips in the Taos, northern New Mexico area, going up to 13,000-foot peaks, coming down to the Rio Grande, kayaking for 9 miles, coming back out, carrying the boats on our back, those kind of things, more adventurous things for people that want to really get into the experience of outdoor wilderness, but also look at the Beatitudes and the Lord's Prayer and Sermon on the Mount, not in an air-conditioned room. And after you've been going for 24 hours overnight, or after you've had a wilderness solo experience, you understand Jesus' solo experience at Gethsemane a lot more. And so this idea of experientially entering into the biblical narrative is something I'm really excited about. And for those of us who are first world, affluent, educated people, We so often are so full of information up here, but have had no real experience with any of that. So bringing that experiential piece, I have found over and over, I've spent, my wife and I both are wilderness leaders, and so together we've probably had 50 years of combined outdoor leadership. But 1,000 Nights Outside has helped me to look at and ask the question, what was Jesus really maybe trying to get at when he said the Beatitudes? So I have a couple of different pieces in the book about rewilding Scripture, rewilding the disciples, rewilding the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. We have these names like Numbers or Deuteronomy. The actual real Hebrew is he called. The actual real Hebrew is in the desert. Like these are visceral names. Numbers, Deuteronomy. How often do you use the word Deuteronomy in a sentence? So the idea of experientially feeling God's grace, experientially feeling community, and that for me, when I bring a group of people into the wild for 12 days, for a week, and there's 12 people, and we're stripped from some of what we're familiar with, we have to start realizing these people are who I have. This food is what I have. These possessions are what I have. I can't go buy something or fix something or post something or like something elsewhere. This is it. And so being present right here, right now, and realizing this is enough is a miraculous Sabbath-like experience. Yes, sir. I think that wherever you can, there's this notion of limits. It's interesting, Outward Bound, the wilderness group started out with healthy self-denial as part of their 5 core principles, that learning how to say okay, that this is enough. Healthy self-denial was one of their 5 core principles, but as it started marketing into America, they dropped that one. I think this notion of learning to be happy with what you have, finding the promised land actually where you are, that we're not needing to always go to a rosier place over here, but rather through your own investment and cultivation and commitment, making the place you live in a stronger place. But there's this dynamic between dislocating in order to relocate. So often I think people born into a place, we have to somehow step out sometimes in order to come back to that very place that we might have been meant to be in the first place. Does that connect with what you're saying? Yes, ma'am.
I think it's really interesting to think about the concept of humbleness and then moral authority. And I wonder if you would talk about that a little bit. Because I think that stops a lot of people, just as children of God stops people.
This lady talked about the word humility and also moral authority, which then therefore seems perhaps arrogant. Or authoritative, and that's one of my favorite topics. The Hebrew word anav, A-N-A-V, is translated so often as meek. So the meek will inherit the earth. It comes from David and also then requoted by Jesus. Meek, does that mean wimpy? Does that mean super quiet? It's interesting that Moses, of all people in the Old Testament, is described as the most humble of all men. And you think of him as being this prophetic leader, this guy who kind of drove people out. And yet in one instance, when they're questioning his leadership, Moses throws himself on the ground in front of them in submission, in the dust. And that's a sign of, you can beat me up and you can trample me if you want because I have veered too far from the law. So he lays himself down completely, and it's only when people lift him back up and affirm that moral authority is he able to then, again, act in that authoritative prophetic way. So it's an emptying in order to be not you who's speaking, but the notion of God's message coming through. So I do feel that there is this notion of humility that then leads out of personal experience into authority. And it may be that the humble are the only ones that are capable of living in the watershed on its terms. They're the only one who have the moral agency as opposed to those who are consuming too much. That's a topic that I'm going to be covering, I think, on Wednesday, in case you want to know that in chapel. I think if you need permission to leave, I'm going to give it to you right now. If you want to stay and talk, I'm more than willing. I know I do need to get somewhere else in a little bit of time, but I'm here up front if you want to talk, and then I'll be going over to the relief sale. I'll be doing a few different engagements both with EMU and with Eastern Mennonite schools over the next few days, and I'll conclude on Wednesday with chapel. Thank you so much for coming today.